Do you miss you miss the heat?
You know, it's the automotive business is a really interesting business. Once you get it,
it's the worst business.
Well,
it's brutal.
Yeah, it's brutal. You know, it's funny and we can talk about this, but when I,
by the way, I just roll. We can just talk about whatever.
When I first joined the company back in '89, you know, I went to Harvard Business School.
Yeah,
and when I was graduating, most of my fellow students, they either went into investment banking or consulting. And when they heard I was going to Ford in Detroit, this is '89, this is when the Japanese were going to take over, and Detroit was kind of going into one of its downturns. I could see the bubble up, you know, on top of their head, that kind of little thought bubble that said, "How many classes did you fail?" Right? Because I was going into manufacturing, I was going to Detroit. I had offers from Microsoft, Sun, Silicon Graphics, and a few others. I was going to come out here.
SGI was hot at the time, too.
Because I had, before I went to business school, I worked at IBM for about 5 years. And I wanted to go back into tech. And I had the interview with Ford. They came on campus, and they were starting this new program.
They came to Harvard campus?
Yeah.
Oh,
it was the first year they had come to Harvard campus in a long time. And I was interested in marketing. And so they were developing this program where for the first 5 years of your career, you can do different assignments within Ford around marketing.
Like a rotational program.
Yeah. And I was interested in those kind of rotational development programs. I was looking at that. I was looking at...
Didn't GE have a good one?
GE, I was offered I actually was offered a job in their financial management program, not their marketing program, which was a really good kind of program. AT&T, a few others. And I went out to Detroit, and, you know, when I took the interview on campus, it was a practice interview for me. It was like one of my first interviews. I'm like, I'll take it. You know, I'll kind of get the rust off. I'll really kind of bone up for the big leagues. And the guy I was talking to, I was like, wow, this sounds really interesting. And so they invited me back to Detroit for some interviews, and I said, okay, I'll do that, but I'd like to spend an extra day at the company sitting in meetings to get a sense for, because what was important to me was culture and people, that kind of stuff. You know, if it was, I wanted the highest salary, I would not have gone to Ford in Detroit.
Yeah.
I would have taken other offers. And I was blown away by the folks. I expected very inward-thinking individuals who, you know, weren't the most kind of thought-provoking because, you know, again, Detroit was sunsetting and they couldn't compete versus the Japanese. And what I found was just really passionate, articulate people. And I was like, wow, this is a place that I'd like to be part of.
What year was that?
This was 1989.
And in '89, when you joined Ford, what was the state of the American industry versus the Japanese industry, and then the state of Ford within the American industry?
So in '89, the industry was going into one of its downturns.
Yeah.
The Japanese were ascendant. They were continuing to gain market share. This was a time where I think a year before, maybe it was 2 years before, Reagan, who was president, instituted voluntary import restrictions on the Japanese. And it was to protect the domestic industry. So in response to that, the Toyotas, the Nissans, the Hondas, they started building plants in the U.S. And that's why today you have, you know, a lot of their production here in the U.S. for the domestic market. So it wasn't, it was a tough industry. It's always been a tough industry, but it was going into one of its cyclical downturns, exacerbated by, you know, the onslaught of the Japanese. And, you know, we can talk about this later, but it goes to my whole ethos of, you know, kind of running to the fire and, you know, why I ended up going there. And
versus some of these other tech companies in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
What was your first job at Ford?
So my first job, it was a great job. I spent a year in marketing product planning. So I learned the core of how you develop new products. And that was important. That was a really important assignment for me for the rest of my career.
I was with the Rivian founder last week.
CJ? Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know him.
RJ.
RJ. Sorry.
Yeah, RJ. I mean, the car business is so tough.
It's tough, but it's fantastic.
You still love it?
Oh, I still love it.
After all the battle scars that you've picked up from it?
I mean, I'm invested in a number of auto-related things. I'm like the CNBC auto guy.
Are you going?
So I can say whatever the fuck I want, and I don't have a board telling me, well, why'd you say that? So I stay, pretty involved in it, and it's it's one of the most complex businesses in the world. And what I loved about it was the complexity and then all the constituents that you have to deal with. Obviously, employees, unions, suppliers, dealers, government, you name it. I mean, it's the whole shebang. And the economic importance of the auto industry is such a priority for every country that we do business in. And I can tell you war stories on how I basically, until I became COO, I was basically always restructuring parts of Ford. So I always had to do the nasty work of closing plants and dealing with governments and unions, et cetera. And it's tough. I mean, if you read even today, there's articles on VW right now, which VW, for the first time, the CEO has said, we're going to put on the table closing plants in Germany, which has been verboten there since the early 90s.
Wow.
And you can see the union responses, et cetera. I mean, I've dealt with everything from tire burnings in front of the plants to having when I was in Europe, it wasn't my office, but the guy who I had running the Ford brand in Europe, because at the time I had Ford and then all of our luxury brands.
Yeah.
Jag, Land Rover, Aston Martin. The plant workers from a plant in Germany or Belgium that we were closing basically ransacked his office. So you deal with all this kind of interesting stuff.
Mark, when I watched all your interviews, it was a real thrill to get to start talking to you because I read about you in American Icon, which is a book that I actually really like. And there's some amazing stories in there, but through a lot of the ways that people even talk to you, talk about you, it's not really rosy. Like I'm not sure how to say this, but it's almost like I always felt like someone had something out for you. Like I never, like you had I don't know if it's part of the job to be the Ford CEO that then have a default target on your back or not. Did you feel that way? Because even in interviews, I'm like, God, these are like far more spicy than what I'm used to for most other CEOs.
Well, I think a couple of things. One is everybody has an opinion on the auto industry. Right? Because most people drive cars, right? So it's a product literally that everybody uses. Getting back to what I mentioned earlier, the importance of the auto industry to various constituents is huge. And so when you're running a car company, you have lots of individuals who have both overt agendas and hidden agendas. And that's just part of the job. It's just part of the job.
Like I remember when Trump was running, wasn't this 2016?
It's 2016.
You were the CEO.
Yes.
And I remember him coming down your street, no pun intended, for saying that, I think what you said was, we're going to build more manufacturing in Detroit and we're going to build manufacturing in Mexico. We're just going to up our manufacturing.
Yeah, exactly.
And then he went on a tear.
Well, it was even more interesting because
I didn't realize that was you when you
So, it's really interesting when I made those kind of announcements, and I heard his response. I immediately was going to pick up the phone and call him, because I had met him once or twice before when he was not running for president, et cetera. Dealing with things in New York. And I didn't know him well personally, but I was so pissed off. I was like, I want to call this guy. And my communications team said, well, you probably don't want to do this. I'm like, then I'm writing a fucking note. And so I wrote him a very nice note, and I kind of corrected some of the facts. And it was fascinating. He sends me back the note, and handwritten on the note, and he faxes it back. And I'm like, this is like it was 2016. I'm like, who the fuck faxes anymore, right? And he sends me back a nice handwritten note that says, Mark, I'm a big fan of Ford, Donald Trump. I'm like, okay, fine. He got the note. He read it. Peace. So then a couple of weeks, it was about a month later, we announced that we were bringing an engine plant back that was producing engines in China, and we were going to produce them in Mexico. And so he glommed onto that, and it just allowed him to fuel the fire around, we're just moving jobs out of the U.S. He didn't care about the facts around that.
Right.
And he basically said, Ford is moving all of its manufacturing jobs out of the U.S.
Right. And
I got so fucking pissed. I told my communications people, I don't care. Get me on CNN, get me on CNBC, get me on,
You did a media tour.
And I got on out of the Ford studio, and I basically used the term, facts are stubborn things. And here are the facts. Because it came to the point where I needed to make sure that as a company, because as the CEO, you are the chief spokesperson for the company. And, I didn't want to start a pissing war with, one of the presidential candidates. But at the same time, you got to be able to kind of stand up and correct things. If for anybody else, for all of the employees and all of our constituents, so that we get our message out. And I did it, and that was it.
It's insane. Have you always, you don't seem to shy away from a good fight.
No.
Like, have you always been that way?
Yeah, I mean.
And I mean that like, not like that you're combative, but I sincerely just don't think you're afraid of a good confrontation.
I'm the youngest of three boys. So, when the youngest of three boys, you get your crap beat out of you when you're growing up, right? And so you get a little bit of toughness around you. I grew up in New Jersey, and, it was a great place to grow up. But, it's when you come from New York, New Jersey, you got a little bit of edge to yourself. And, I've always tried to run to the fire. It's funny, when I was CEO, we hired a lot of employees. We were doing one of our biggest manufacturing expansions across the globe. We were hiring a lot for not only our existing product plan, but for things we were doing with EVs and autonomy. And twice a year, I would do a big session with all the new employees. And my team came to me and said, hey, they'd love to hear from you as the CEO. I'm like, great. And they'd like to hear how you got to be CEO. Mm. It's like, wow, that's kind of interesting. I use the example, when the media asked me when I was named CEO, they said, hey, when you joined the company in 89, did you have your aspirations to be CEO? And I'm like, hell no, I just wanted a job a year from now, right? And so I didn't put a presentation together. I put a couple of slides, but I'm not a big presenter. I just like talking. Mm. And so they asked me, what pieces of advice would you give, new employees? And I said, one of the key pieces of advice I always give, whether it's our new employees or when we're recruiting on campus, is just run to the fire, right? Go to those assignments that not necessarily are the sexiest ones out there that everybody wants to go to. Go to the ones that are really going to stretch you and challenge you. And in my career at Ford, they always sent me to places that had to be fixed. And my thought was, hey, I'm going to go there. It's going to be tough, but I'm going to learn a lot of things. And if I'm successful, well, that'll help my career. If I'm not successful, I will have learned a lot of things, and that will serve me well in whatever I do next, whether it's with Ford or somebody else. But I always kind of thrived on those kind of things. Just really good challenges that would stretch me. And it even came back to, like my college days. I went to school at Rutgers. It was a great place to go to school. And I learned, and I told this to my kids when they went to school, I said, never let school get in the way of your education. And what I meant by that was when I went to school, I joined a fraternity, and I learned not only how to apply myself to my studies, which I did, very well with my studies, and it wasn't because I was some, brilliant guy in the Mensa, community. I wasn't. I just kind of worked my ass off in studying. But I also, at the same time, had a great balance. I spent a lot of time, partying and dealing with my fraternity members, and learning how to live in a house with 49 other guys, and how you need to understand people, how you have to develop relationships and things of that nature. And I thought that was a great foundation for me of making sure I did really well on my studies, but also at the same time, I learned how to be a good person and hopefully be viewed as a good person and having good relationships with others and dealing with, sometimes sticky situations. An example is one year I was a pledge master, which was an awesome semester. I had 16 guys, and, you had to be responsible for their development. You had to be responsible for not to hurt them, right? With hazing and that kind of stuff. But we always had a Christmas party. And so we always gave the pledges. We said, go out and get materials to decorate the house. So one overeager pledge went in front of the president's house at the university and cut down a Japanese tree for the branches and dragged them actually to our house. And our fraternity house was literally almost across the street from the president's house. So the next day we, get knocks on the door from the university police, and we're like, what's going on? They said, well, there's been a vandalism at the president's house. I'm like, what are you talking about? One of their, I think it was a Japanese fir tree or something like that. They said it was mutilated, cut down, whatever. I'm like, oh, that's too bad. And I look over in the corner, and I see the branches that the pledges had brought in to decorate the house. I'm like, oh, shit. And the reason that they found out it was us is because they dragged it to the house up the stairs, front stairs, and of course, all the needles and all the tree were like, it was a really easy, detective. You didn't have to be a real detective to figure out what the hell happened. And so you had to deal with those kind of situations. And, I've just always been, drawn to challenging things that will test me as a person, but also, help me develop as a leader.
Do you miss leading people today?
I do, but when you're CEO, and even the last probably 10 or 15 years when I was at Ford, I was running large portions of Ford. So
before CEO was running North America?
Before CEO,
COO.
I ran COO, and then before that ran North and South America.
Yep.
Then before that ran Europe, Ford of Europe, and all of our luxury brands. Before that, ran Mazda. We owned a third of Mazda, so by Japanese commercial code, you can appoint the CEO and a few other C-suite positions. So I was running, a global Japanese automaker, which was a fascinating experience. And before that was running, Ford Argentina. So really, when I started running Mazda it was 99 or 2000, for the next 15, 16 years, I was running large portions of Ford. And, it's 24/7, right? So there was lots of personal sacrifices that I made for that. So when I retired from Ford, Do I miss it? Do I miss leading people? Absolutely. At the same token, I kind of use this opportunity to create kind of the next chapter in my life. And I do so many different things now. And it's interesting, when you stay in an industry I was at Ford for 28 years, you just get focused. You're so focused on your one industry. I didn't really give a lot of credence to what other people did. I'm like, there's nothing like the car industry. It's the biggest thing out there. And now after, that I retired from Ford, I found out there's a whole big wide world out there to do a lot of different things. So I've kind of taken the opportunity for this next chapter in my life to have a lot of variety. I'm not leading people. But I am working with great companies, with great CEOs. I'm doing a lot of mentoring for the CEOs. And to me, that's like kind of paying it forward.
Yeah, a different version of leadership.
Yeah, exactly. But do I miss being a CEO? Yes, but you have to really be honest with yourself. And you tend to always romanticize all the things you loved about being a CEO. And then you have to remember all the things that you didn't like about being a CEO. And you got to be really honest with yourself on, do you want to do that again? I had the opportunity to be interim CEO at Hertz. Post-Ford. And it was very similar organizations, very long histories, 100 years, automotive related, et cetera. Great people, very dedicated people. And they asked me to be the permanent CEO, and I said I would just do it for a period of time. And the reason for that was I made the commitment to my wife that when I moved back to Detroit from running Europe to run North and South America, it was 2005, towards the end of 2005, and we had lived overseas about 10 or 11 years. And originally the deal with my wife was we'd live overseas for 2 years. And when we moved, and I have a terrific wife. I've schlepped her to the four corners of the earth. We've lived in a lot of different places. And when we moved first overseas, we had a newborn and a toddler, my two boys. And by the time when I was running Europe, this was beginning of 2005, we made the decision that we would move my wife and my boys back to our vacation house in Florida because we wanted our sons to have some of their upbringing in their home country. And so the deal I had with my wife was, you guys move there. We had a vacation house there. I'll come out for a long weekend once a month and we'll somehow make it work.
From Detroit?
From London.
From London.
Because I was living in London at the time. And I thought I was going to be in Europe for another 3 years. I had already been in London about 3 years, and, I was told I'd probably be there another 2 or 3 years. So I moved my family back to Florida, and of course, like 5 months later, I got asked to come back to Detroit to run North and South America. So I told my wife, we had a long discussion, and I said, listen, you just stay in Florida. I've moved you and the kids so many times. You're finally settled. I said, I'm going to be working 24/7. You're literally never going to see me. So I will come to you. And literally from the end of 2005 to when I retired in May of 2017, I commuted back and forth between Detroit and Florida.
How often?
Literally every week.
Every week?
Yeah.
So I would, like Thursday or something?
No. I would leave Friday nights and I would come back Sunday afternoons because I felt it was important. First off, I bought a house in Detroit, right? I didn't want to be viewed as, one of these carpetbaggers that, just flies in and flies out. So I bought a house in Detroit, and because of the scope of the job, I felt I needed to be there. So I was there Sunday afternoons and I left Friday nights. And so, I had Saturdays and Sunday mornings with my family.
Basically just Saturday.
Yeah. And, again, being very honest with myself, I was physically there, but you're always thinking about
it's just
job.
one day.
Yeah.
Like you've barely even unwound from the day before and you're thinking about the next day.
But, people ask me, they said,
and sorry, continue.
I have a wonderful wife. We've been married 35 years. She's allowed me to have the career that I've had because she's sacrificed, she's moved around and all that kind of stuff. And people ask me, they said, well, how many years have you been married? Well, I've been married 35 years. And they said, what's the secret sauce? I'm like, live away for half of it, right? Because I was in Detroit. But I reflect on that, and, there's lots of discussions on work-life balance and how you balance those things. And even today, back then when I commuted, not many people did that. Today, post-COVID, work from home, it's more prevalent. But I kind of think back on that, and I said, literally every day I would call my wife at the end of the day, and we'd talk for about an hour. And I probably communicated more with her because we were apart than if I was there. Because if I was there, I'd come home for dinner, we'd spend a little bit of time together, I'd grunt at her, and then I'd go back to my emails and ignore the kids. Whereas by being away, I actually had really focused time every day to talk with her and talk with the kids. And maybe I'm rationalizing, but the good news is my kids still love me. So, they felt they had a good upbringing. But
are you close with them?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Not just your wife. You're close with the kids.
Oh, yeah. We're a very close family, even though we all live different places.
Yeah.
But it was funny. I always tried to, because my job was so encompassing over the last 15, 16 years at Ford, I brought the kids to a lot of events. Like when we would do car introductions, in the car industry, when you introduce a new product,
it's pretty cool.
You invite the media in, you take them to really interesting places. For example, when this was probably 2002, 2003, when I was running Europe and all the luxury brands, we were introducing the new Range Rover. And so we brought all the media to Spain, and I brought my wife and the kids. And so my sons have always been around adults, and I wanted them to kind of be around adults to, kind of learn how to interact and all that kind of stuff. And we were demonstrating the rock climbing capabilities of the Range Rover. And we were in this location where there was basically, a mountain with a 30-degree angle. And we were demonstrating how the Range Rover could actually scale that easily. And it was funny, as we were talking and the media was, getting ready to film, and they said, how much confidence do you have in the capability of this vehicle to do that? I said, I have so much confidence, I'm going to put my two small sons in the back seat with the driver. And so my wife looked at me like, what? I said, don't worry. We put the two kids in the back seat. The driver did a great job, bringing the vehicle up and, climbing the mountain and articulating appropriately, et cetera. And then it came back down. So I've always tried to kind of bring the kids and my family along with me where I could, so that they could at least have some time with me when I'm at work, but also understand what I did at work.
When you were working 24/7, did you not ask yourself why you're working this way?
I did, and I had, let's say, a lot of rationalization. I was always, people may kind of always say, I was really conflicted. I had my family life, I had my work life. I had a lot of, I'm very dedicated to my family, but I also know I was very driven by what I love to do in terms of work, right? Mm-hmm. It gave me so much purpose and so much enjoyment that I always knew I was sacrificing, but I also knew I had a wonderful wife who was understanding. And in my own mind, I said, listen, I'm selfish, right? I love what I do and I want to keep doing it. But also at the same time, how do I not end up divorced and my kids hate me? And so I always tried to do, things that I just mentioned where, I would bring them on certain events so they can understand what I did. And also bring them to, fun stuff. For example, every year I'd bring my wife and my kids up to Detroit. We'd go to a game at the Big House in Michigan. And we'd do the whole tailgating and, we just had my kids, they had heard me growing up. I went to a big state school in New Jersey. And so it was great fun for them. Ultimately, they both ended up going to Michigan because they didn't want to go to Florida schools. They're like, awesome. We've seen what it's like. We want to go there. But yeah, I always asked myself, but if I'm totally honest with myself, I was always selfish. And that it gave me so much satisfaction. And listen, at the same time, I always was trying to be successful so my family could be successful, right? Financially independent, all that kind of stuff. And that was an element of it, but it really came down to this is what I love to do, and this is what gives me energy, and I over-indexed on that versus, I was really conflicted with my family and time, and that's why I always tried to talk with my wife every night and my kids and go home every weekend and made sure that I didn't sacrifice that completely to my career aspirations and what I love to do.
I was talking to someone here internally about this. Who was I talking to? Mamoon. And there's only 2 patterns that I have found in this show. It's probably 210 episodes.
Wow.
And everyone asked me, what are the themes? What are the common themes amongst these people? There's only 2. The first is unsurprisingly grit, like an ability to overcome hard things.
Yep.
The second is a strong partner at home. I can't believe that one because in my mind, maybe it was because of the people that I grew up around or the way that it's portrayed in movies that I would watch when I was a kid.
Yep.
These successful people often did so at the sacrifice of their home life. But I have found almost without exception that to not be the case with the folks that I speak to.
Yeah.
Super interesting.
Well, it's people always asked me when I was running Ford and big parts of Ford, you do the pulse surveys, and what always is at the top of the list is work-life balance. And even in the companies I'm involved with today, you do the pulse surveys, et cetera. That's always there. And I think the term work-life balance is a misnomer. I look at it as you have one life. You have one life. And within that one life, you have to come to whatever you feel comfortable with your balance on what you do for work, what you do for your family, what you do for personal satisfaction, the things that give you energy. Just, you have one life and just deal with it that way. Versus, well, I got work-life balance. And, well, first off, as many people know, there's no such thing as work-life balance if you have a challenging job. But you have to look at it as you have one life. You have 24 hours in the day, and how are you going to spend that? And, I've always kind of compartmentalized it, said, listen, I'm going to go full out in my work life. I'm going to make sure I find time in whatever way I can for my family life and not do it sporadically. Just do it very consistently. Versus I feel a little guilty. I haven't talked to my wife for a week, so I'll give her a call, that kind of thing. And then in your personal life, the things that give you energy are so important. The things that always gave me energy was, being in the gym and just working out. And so what I would do is after a long day of work, I'd always lived near a gym, and I'd go to the gym late at night. And it wasn't just for keeping me in physical shape. It was a way for me to mentally process the day and just have time to think. And having those three things, how much you want to spend on work life, how much you want to spend on the personal things that give you energy, how much you want to spend on family, it's one life, and just make it work within that. And yeah, I think it's really interesting what you mentioned around, the sacrifices that people make and, ended up with broken families, et cetera. But that's a really interesting insight that the majority of folks that you've spoken to have made it work. And I think it gets to, at least in my case, having a very understanding partner, communicating. There's no problem with my wife communicating to me and me communicating to my wife. It's funny. Like when I retired from Ford, we're in the kitchen a week later, and my wife's terrific, and she was doing something, and I said, "Hey, well, maybe you want to do it that way." And she turned around to me and she goes, "Mark, last week you were in charge of 200,000 people. Today you're in charge of none." I'm like, all right, I get it. Put me in my place. I got it. But just, being able to communicate and just work through issues. I mean, just like in your work life, there's lots of challenges, right? And you either take those challenges head on and be honest with yourself, honest with your team on what the reality is, and deal with it in a positive way. And it's the same thing I view in my personal life with, being married for as long as I have. It's not a cakewalk, right? You have to work through issues in your life, and you can choose to work through them and communicate and deal with them, or you can choose, I don't want to deal with that, and we'll see where the chips fall.
Our mutual friend Mark McLaughlin, amazing man.
I mean, he's awesome.
He said something when we talked that really stuck with me. When he left as the CEO of Palo Alto Networks, he was, I don't know, I'm just guessing 50s. Like he was at the prime of his career.
Yeah, he was early 50s.
He was at the prime of his career, and he was beloved. He was beloved at this company.
Mm-hmm.
And he left for personal reasons to go basically homeschool his son. And he said, "Jubin, on Friday, I was a very relevant person in Silicon Valley and not very relevant at home. And by Monday, I was extremely relevant at home and not so relevant in Silicon Valley."
Right.
And it's really powerful. It happens just like that.
It does.
And it reminds me of the comment that you just made of, so much of the 25 years of managing people and running Ford and doing all these, in air quotes, important things that made you feel a certain type of way about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I think the selfishness, as you described it, right? That's the selfishness.
Yep.
Is almost the ego that it
absolutely.
gives you, right?
It's
feeling important.
Yeah, exactly.
And in some ways, what purpose really means is you feeling important to go do something, right? Now, you can find a bunch of ways towards purpose,
Yep.
but ultimately you want to feel important. Whether that's important towards climate change, whether that's important towards managing and building teams, whether that's important towards making money for your limited partners.
Yep.
You could come up with all sorts of different ways to find purpose. But I think that when I talk to people like you, who then all of a sudden, are in the kitchen with their wives and very quickly, it's all gone.
Yeah.
It's like an athlete who retires, and all of a sudden, it's like, wait a second, what am I now?
Well, it's really scary for people, right? I mean, in my case, so in terms of the purpose piece, just put even more an exclamation point on purpose. I also felt it was not only kind of ego driven. It was not only, a selfishness that I, love to work, love to lead my teams, but it was also a real commitment to my teams and their families. And the way that came home to me was when, went through a Great Recession. GM and Chrysler went bankrupt. We did not. So about 3 years later, every year we used to have the North American International Auto Show in January in Detroit. It was the big auto show for the U.S. And the day before the opening, where we do the press days and do all the intros, all the smoke and mirrors and all that kind of stuff, we would always invite a lot of our employees to see our rehearsal of the press conference. And so we'd bring them all down. Our press conferences were usually in the old Joe Louis Arena, so it would sit like 3,500 people. So we invited employees and their families down. And we had a lottery because we couldn't have all the employees, because we had over like 20,000 employees just in the Dearborn area. And so it was about 3 years later, we invited the employees, we did the press conference rehearsal, and then afterwards we would let all the employees and their kids come down and see the cars and touch them and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm milling around, I'm talking with employees, and a woman comes up to me with her husband and her 13-year-old daughter. And she says, "I just want to say thank you." I'm like, "What are you thanking me for?" She goes, "We didn't go bankrupt, which means my husband still has a job, still has a pension, and that's going to allow my 13-year-old daughter to go to college." And it hit me like a ton of bricks. I was just like, it really brought home to me that as a leader, yes, you run a business, but you have a responsibility to your employees, to their families, to the communities. And that's also what drove me as well. But then fast forward to your point, one day you're CEO, the next day you're not. And I talk to a lot of CEOs that are going through this. I got a lot of phone calls because I've been through it. And it's scary, right? Because, and one of the things that always kept me grounded was my dad wrote me a letter when I became CEO of Mazda. And one of the lines in the letter, and I still have this letter to this day, he said, "Never let your title get wrapped up into the value of yourself." And I always thought about that. And it also kept me very humble, because when I would every weekend go from Detroit to Florida, in Detroit, everybody knows who you are, right? Because it's a very automotive dominated town. Where I lived in Florida, nobody knew much about the auto industry. So when I would go to backyard barbecues or cocktail parties, people would ask me, "What do you do?" I said, "I work for Ford." And they go, "What dealership?" And I was like, man, awesome. It kept me really grounded. But when you're faced with you're not the leader anymore. You don't have meetings every day, 24/7. When you don't have all the things that you have to do as a CEO, when you don't have the corporate plane anymore, and the first time you got to go on, Expedia and make your own plane reservations because you don't have an assistant anymore. It's really scary. And my thought, just like others, is the day, it's kind of like the expiration date on a can of milk. You feel like you have, if you're not in the game, that you're going to get stale. And you have to come to terms with that and say, how do you deal with that? And it's very scary for individuals. And that's why, I always looked at, as I was growing up at Ford, I would see executives who would, work until their retirement date. And then a lot of them actually passed away very quickly after they left Ford, because they didn't spend the time on, where did they want to live? What was their social, who were their friends? What was the social structure? All that kind of stuff. So I always paid a lot of attention to that, only because that note that my dad sent me when I got my first, kind of real leadership job at Ford said, never get yourself wrapped up in your title. But you have to deal with that. And the best advice that I got, and I give to others, is when that happens. And in my case, let's face it, I didn't retire voluntarily at Ford, right? I had a short tenure as CEO, about 3 years. And so it was abrupt. And I had to deal with that. But whether you're dealing with that kind of situation or, as a CEO or a senior leader, you're facing your retirement date, you really kind of have to think through and take your time, right? Because the best advice I got was, don't jump at the first thing. Think through what you like to do, what you don't like to do. Take however many, take 2 months, take 6 months, take a year. Don't jump at the first thing, because the initial thought is the next day I got to be doing something, right? Because I have this fear of just getting stale and becoming more and more irrelevant. And I've seen friends of mine who jumped at the first thing and were miserable a year later. And so I didn't take 6 months. I took 3 months before, I started doing things again. But that's the best advice I give folks. But it's scary, right?
It's funny. Mark McLaughlin has the same advice.
Yeah.
His is a year. Like, now he's almost, he's like business Zen Buddhist now,
Yeah.
So take it with what you will. But he says, and the way he defined it, I thought was very well articulated, which is like, the adrenaline of your career takes time to wear off.
Yeah.
And in his point, which is similar to yours, is it takes longer than you think.
It does. I mean, literally for 3 months after I left Ford, I was still getting up at 5 a.m., saying, where's my first meeting, right? The most bizarre day is the first day of your, after you leave. You're like, oh my gosh, like, what am I supposed to do?
Right.
And so, you could fall into different buckets, right? When you do that, you can decide you're going to do something right away. And I think a lot of times that doesn't work out for folks because they're running away from something versus running to something.
Yeah.
The second bucket is, they find something in their life, whether it's a sport or a nonprofit or something, they go really deep on that. And some really like that. A lot of times that kind of peters out over time. And then there's the third bucket, and I know folks they completely just turn off. They're like, I'm cool with that. I have a good buddy of mine. He retired at 55, very successful, and he's been fishing for 10 years now, and he loves it. And he always jokes with me. He goes, Mark, why are you working so much? Because I probably work on all the different things I'm involved in. I probably spend 60% of my time, 65% of my time working. And I tell him, I said, listen, I love to work. It gives me a lot of, that satisfaction piece of it. It helps me with my personal life and my relationship with my wife and my family. But the good news is I never had 35% of time for myself. So to me, that's a gift, right? I can travel, I can, pursue my hobbies, etc. And just, kind of thinking through in your retirement or once you, the day after your retirement or well before, what's the priority of things that I'm interested in? And what's the funnel I'm going to use to actually filter through different opportunities?
You're saying right now you work about 4.5 days a week.
Yeah.
On average.
Yeah.
But what was it before?
Oh, it was 7 days a week.
Nonstop.
Yeah.
Like, let's assume 100 is impossible. Well, what percent? Yeah. Like 95?
Hours a week?
Like, no, percentage of your life filled with work.
It's probably close to 95% because the way I'll answer that is not only working, but you're thinking about the business always. Yeah. Like, people always ask me, they said, what keeps you up at night? I'm like, nothing. By the time my head hits the pillow, I'm freaking damn tired.
Yeah.
Because, you go to sleep thinking about the business, you wake up and the first thing is you think about the business. It's just the nature of the beast and being a CEO and really embracing that. And what I mean by that is another piece of advice that I got early on in my career. It was the first time I became a manager. And one of my supervisors told me, because remember, Mark, people are looking at you every day as the leader in whatever department you're in or, business unit, et cetera. They not only look at what you say, but how you say it, your body language. And, if you're not enthusiastic or passionate about what you do, somehow that gets transmitted to the rest of the organization. And it doesn't mean, in my view, manipulating people or not being somebody that you are, but so much around leading with positive energy and not being a victim has always been an important part of how I worked, how I led, because it's easy to be a victim, right? When GM and Chrysler were going bankrupt, it was easy to be a victim. I remember the day Chrysler went bankrupt, because Chrysler went bankrupt, I think 1 or 2 months before GM did. So I got my team, my senior team together, and we used to have this big table, round table. So there'd be about 20 of us around the table. And I asked each one of them, and they were, obviously the news came out, Chrysler was going bankrupt. We were concerned because if Chrysler or GM didn't get funds from the government, that they, GM would go bankrupt, and then the supply base would go bankrupt. And when the supply base went bankrupt, we would go bankrupt because we shared a lot of the same suppliers. So we were lobbying at the time a lot for the...
You wanted them to get bailed out.
Yes. Yeah. Mainly GM. If Chrysler went bankrupt, we probably, we said, the supply base will probably survive. But if GM went bankrupt, it was over. But on the day when Chrysler went bankrupt, everybody's kind of looking around, wondering, what's going to happen to the business, what's going to happen to the U.S. economy, all that kind of stuff. A lot of nervousness. We were all nervous. So what I did is I asked everybody to go around individually, and I asked them, tell me why you joined Ford originally and what keeps you here. And everybody gave their individual story. And by the time we were done, it was fantastic. It was, the themes were, I came to Ford because I love cars, I love the company, I love what I'm doing now, I have a responsibility to my family, to my employees, etc. And by the time we had all kind of gone around the table, we had realized, you know what? We're not going to be victims. We're going to deal with the cards as they are. We're going to deal with them in a positive way, and we're going to find a way through this. And it's just a way as a leader to, how do you deal with adversity, right? If you beat the crap out of people, guess what? You're going to get maybe compliance, but you're not going to get motivation and passion.
What did you have to do at that point once Chrysler went under?
Well, we had actually, we knew that GM and Chrysler were going to run out of money about 6 months before they actually ran out of money. So, we had great benchmarking. We had great finance teams that, we'd look at all the competitive benchmark info, et cetera. So we knew that something was coming. That's why when I originally came back to run North America at the end of 2005, we started restructuring the business. And people asked me, they said, did you know in another year and a half that, the economy was going to tank? Like, no, we're not that smart. Our business was going into the tank earlier than theirs were.
So you started slashing costs when you came in.
Exactly.
To run North America.
Exactly. We closed over by the time we got through.
It was just early enough to give you just enough runway.
Exactly. And it also gave us time to go to the capital markets to raise the debt. We raised about, I think it was $32 or $33 billion. And we did it before the financial markets closed because of the Great Recession. And it wasn't because we were smarter than others and we're like, oh, we see this Great Recession coming. It's because our business needed it. And so we were fortunate, but we also, we took the medicine early, right? By the time we had structured North America, we had to say goodbye to literally about 35-40% of our salaried workforce and about 40% of our hourly workforce. And we closed a number of plants across the country. But we needed to do that to position the business for success. And what happened was, during the Great Recession, because we had already done a lot of the restructuring, because we had secured the financing, it allowed us to continue to invest in product during that time. So what happened is, as we got through the Great Recession and you got into 2011, 12, 13, we had all fresh product coming out, whereas our competitors did not. And we also benefited from, and I hadn't realized this when we were advocating for support, federal government support for GM and Chrysler. There was a real negative pushback from the public on bailing out companies at this time, right? Whether it was banks or automotive companies, and we got a lot of credit from customers on we didn't take the money. And there was actually T-shirts that were produced in our plants by some of our plant personnel, which were great. It was like, Ford, we didn't take the money. And I thought that would last maybe a year, maybe 18 months.
The public's goodwill.
Yeah. It probably lasted 4 or 5 years.
Wow.
But again, it was a testament to our teams.
I mean, in some ways, don't you think it propelled you into the CEO job?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think people ask me, how did I get to become CEO? And it wasn't because I ever thought, I want to become CEO. It was, again, I always took the jobs that were really messy and hard. And, I always kind of did well in them. And, that it teaches you a lot of humility. It teaches you how to rally a team. It teaches you how to stay balanced for your team, because as the leader, there were days like when we were restructuring North America, I'd come home, we'd take 2 steps back that day and I wanted to put my head through the drywall in the house. There were other days when we made a good step forward. And I always tried to keep myself balanced on where we were heading versus how did we do that day or week. Because if we did, I would have drove myself crazy. And that would have manifested itself on how I led my team, right? And how I talked about things or my body language or whatever. And I never wanted I wanted people to feel like they could have somebody that could be consistent and not be all over the place, particularly during times of great stress. And it's important for, employees, your constituencies. We had to deal with, our dealers and work with them and our suppliers. But the reason I became CEO was because I took assignments nobody really wanted to take that were tough. I was able to perform with great teams. And, I was, again, I had a family that would go to different parts of the world and get different experiences, which were very important and influential in not only my leadership journey, but also understanding the company so that, ultimately when I became CEO, I had led almost all parts of the company.
The CEO, it was 3 years CEO?
Yeah. It's 3 years CEO and 2 years as COO.
1 to 10, honest take. How would you have graded yourself as a CEO?
So,
I'm sure you've done an annoying amount of reflection on this.
Yeah, I've done a lot of reflection. So I think on the performance of the company, I would give myself a 9 or 10. I mean, we had record profits, record operating margins, not only for North America when I ran North America, but during my tenure as CEO. So from a financial standpoint, we were really kind of running, hitting on all cylinders, so to speak. I think when it came to strategy, we had laid out a strategy to, significantly invest in our product pipeline and invest in EVs and autonomy. And so I think I would give myself probably a 7 on that. I think where I really underperformed is a couple of ways. One is the stock price during my tenure was down about 30%. So despite the fantastic operating performance we were having and the financials we were delivering, I hadn't articulated enough to the street our strategy for the future and why that should be reflected in the value of our company. And, part of it is, and it's endemic, and I'm not making excuses to this, but it's endemic in the whole auto industry that as the industry has pivoted to EVs and technology and putting modems in vehicles and getting more recurring revenue, et cetera, we always tried to highlight that to help reflect the value and ultimately our stock price. But at the end of the day, a lot of investors just view, well, you're a metal bender, right? And you guys destroy capital over years, and you have, and your multiple is going to reflect that. But even so, our stock price had underperformed GM's during my tenure. And I reflect back, and I would definitely give myself a 3 or 4 on that. And then, you know, the other place that I think I really underperformed, and I learned a lot. You know, I always joke with the folks that I mentor these days, you can take advantage of my quote unquote experience, which is the name I give my mistakes. So I have plenty of experience to share with you. But, you know, when you become CEO, the one thing nobody ever teaches you in business school, nor do you get any on-the-job experience before you become CEO, is how you deal with a board. And boards are interesting things, right? Boards are not teams. They're a collection of individuals, and they all bring their specific skill sets to the table. And I probably did not do a good job on building relationships and managing that dynamic. It was complicated by the fact that we had an executive chairman, Bill Ford, so I was not chairman and CEO. So there's always there's a little blurring of lines there, but nonetheless, I would not give myself a good grade for that.
How many Ford family members are on the board?
When I don't know how many are today, but when I was on the board, there were 2 Ford family members.
Out of how many board members?
We had a big board. We had, I think, 13 or 14 members.
But I imagine, it's Ford. It's the name of the company.
Yeah, it's Ford. But listen, I give Bill Ford a lot of credit because he goes out of his way to make sure, at least while I was there, that it's not just the Bill Ford show.
Totally.
He went out of his way, and rightfully so, to make sure that as we're making decisions on the company, that the full board was involved. But, boards are funny things. I mean, I remember, some things you remember in your career, like when GM and Chrysler were going bankrupt and we would have our board meetings. Sometimes we had more lawyers in the room than board members or management teams because we were trying to work our way through those things. And you learn a lot. I learned a lot about, because I saw really good board members and I saw not so good board members. And the way I've learned during my career, and this is what I encourage a lot of young people to do, is, when you can get on committees, like operating committees, or be part of a team, that's developing a product or something like that, those are great experiences to learn from others in how they conduct themselves. And I learned a lot about good leadership behaviors by sitting in, a lot of operating committee meetings that I was on during my career. And I learned some really bad behaviors. And it was it was a free education for me. But you also learn a lot about people. And it surprises you sometimes particularly during tough times, people you wouldn't expect to step up, really step up. And people that, had great reputations that wouldn't. I mean, I'll give you an example. Like when we were going through the Great Recession and GM and Chrysler were going bankrupt and we were kind of on the edge, we had a couple of board members that decided to resign. It's like, oh, that's interesting.
Wow.
And we had other board members who really stepped up. It's very interesting to see, how people react and what their motivations are in times. Forget the good times, right? Everybody looks like they're a genius in good times, but it's during the tough times. It's really the crucible of what you learn about people.
When you were the CEO, your agenda to me seemed quite ambitious. You set out you bought, what's the company in the Bay?
Argo?
Argo?
Yes.
You bought Argo, which is an AI company.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't you buy the Chariot?
Yes.
Chariot.
Yeah, it was the van,
which actually was good.
Yeah, it actually was a good little business.
I think we could still use that.
Yeah,
but whatever.
Yeah.
So it's like kind of like a Uber pool,
mobility on demand for for commuters.
You created a autonomy and self-driving team, correct? Who ironically, the person that you appointed to be the CEO of that team then ended up becoming the CEO of Ford after you.
Yeah.
Which maybe, I don't know how that made you feel. And I think in many ways, that vision needs time to cement.
It does.
And I think probably, again, you tell me, but the stock price was partially getting punished because that vision hadn't come to fruition yet.
Right. And we kind of laid out, listen, you got in.
And you didn't get the benefit of the doubt.
Right. Well, it's like any business. You got to spend money to make money. And sometimes those two things there's a lag period.
Yeah.
And, I think what I did when I became CEO is, you're always thinking about, yes, here are the objectives you want to meet. You want to meet your financial objectives, operating objectives, all those kind of things. But, you also need to lay out, what do you want to accomplish during your tenure? And I had looked back over the past 5 or 6 CEOs at Ford to get a sense for what was their legacy of their tenure. And I spent a lot of time on that to kind of understand, what did I want mine to be? And I wanted mine to be, Ford to become not only a great car company, but a great mobility company as well. And I also was very clear that as we started investing in EVs, that we didn't go so far in terms of over-investing that we neglected our, the products that were delivering all the cash and profits today. And there was interesting discussions in the board and the company on how fast we should go, et cetera. And so, I tried to communicate, first off, what were the opportunities, right? You go through, here's the addressable market, here's, why we can be differentiated, here's some economics, but it's going to require, investments that's going to take time to come to fruition. And like I said, I did not do a good job on articulating that as best as I could.
Managing the timelines and expectations with your different constituents.
Exactly. And laying out some breadcrumbs along the way to show the progress.
Wins.
Exactly.
A few small wins.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that was a big lesson learned for me. But, I think when you look at the industry today, I think I was right on, not over-indexing on EVs to such a large, some of, like GM, they went out and they said, oh, we're going to be all electric by 2035. Now every automaker is walking back their commitments because I felt very strongly that, yes, ultimately the industry, we're going to evolve towards pure electric vehicles. If for any other reason, oil is it's a non-recurring reserve. I mean, it's going to delete itself over time. There's not going to be oil in 50 years. But at the same time, I felt there wasn't enough, and I still feel this today, there's not enough focus on the consumer and their motivations, right? So if you look at the EV market today, there's lots of discussion around, well, we need to solve the cost differential. Yes, the industry's working on that, but even still today, buying an EV is more costly than buying an ICE or an internal combustion engine vehicle. Then we also have to solve the infrastructure issue, right? And that's what everybody's focusing on. But the industry will solve the cost issue. The infrastructure issue is going to take time, and it's not only building out the infrastructure, but making sure that infrastructure is in very visible places for consumers. You can't build out the infrastructure and have, at the local Target, the EV chargers in the back near the loading dock. I mean, you literally have to go out of your way to put them on street corners, heavily trafficked street corners, where the consumer that may not be buying an EV today sees it and says, hey, the next time I'm in the market, hey, I see that there's infrastructure out there. But nobody's talking about the third piece, which is the convenience factor for consumers. My view is I don't care what demographic you're in, what income you have, et cetera. The one luxury that everybody covets is time. And so when you think about the charging time to charge an EV, right, it's if it's going to take you 40 minutes at a supercharger, or even 25 minutes at a supercharger to recharge your vehicle, versus the 3 minutes it takes you to fill up your gas at the local Exxon station and buying your Slurpee, consumers are going to say, you know what? When you guys figure that out, then I'll really, buy an EV. But until you figure that out, maybe I will, maybe I won't. And it's just more complications for consumers. And that's why I think that'll get solved over time. But I think that's what the industry has missed, which is that real focus on, when it comes to mass adoption, it's very different than early adopters, right? Early adopters are thinking about, I want the latest technology. I want to have a great impact on the environment. I want the latest and coolest things. I got 3 or 4 other cars, so I'll take it. Mass adoption, when you're talking about, the consumer that, is not rich and has 1 car, maybe 2 cars, doesn't, live in a house that has a 2-car garage, you really got to focus on meat and potato issues for them. And I think that's what the industry has missed, and that's why you're seeing a lot of recalibration now.
I think it's well said. Can I tell you what I think the coolest thing that you did as CEO was? Again, tell me if this is wrong, but you wanted to win how do I pronounce it? Le Mans. You wanted to win it.
Yes.
And the last time that it was won in a Ford car was 1966 or something?
69.
1969.
But we first won it in 66.
First won it in 66. The last time, okay, and then 69. That's the movie Ford versus Ferrari was based on that. And you decided, we're going to win this thing in France. It's a 24-hour race. Why did you do that? I mean, it's awesome. Did you do it just because it's awesome?
Well, we had originally done the first GT in the 60s, and the film was very accurate. Henry Ford wanted to buy Ferrari, and, they decided to sell the Fiat at the last moment, and Henry Ford II got really pissed off and said, I'm going to produce a vehicle that wins at Le Mans. And he did, and the movie was very accurate, with the exception of, it's funny, when the movie came out, the Ferrari Club where I live invited me to the theater that they rented out so that we can see the movie. And the movie starts, and there's a scene early on where Enzo Ferrari basically tells his guys to go back to Henry Ford and tell him, I'm not selling to you, and oh, by the way, you're fat. And they all get up, and they start clapping, whatever. And when they're done, I get up, and I go, do you know how this movie ends? So, but it was very accurate. So we won, and then we won for 4 years. It took us, I think the first race was 62 or 63. So it took us like 2 or 3 years to win for the first time. So we'd done the first generation GT. The second generation GT was done in 2005 and 6. And we produced 3,000 of those vehicles. We never raced it, but it was a way to celebrate the 100 years of Ford, and it was a great product. I always wanted to do the third generation GT. But when I was running North America, and when I was, we were obviously going through the Great Recession, and those kind of low volume, high engineered cars lose a lot of money. And so as we were coming out of the Great Recession, my head of product development came to me and said, the 50th anniversary of our Le Mans win is coming up. I go, oh, you're right. He goes, I know you want to do the third generation GT, so let me put a proposal together. So he comes back like a month or so later, and because we were so focused on efficiency and cost reduction because of the scars that left us from the Great Recession, he came back with a proposal that basically was a souped up Mustang. And I looked at him and I said, okay, so if we race this in Le Mans, and there's 4 different series that you can race in Le Mans, we would race in the sport version, which is kind of the production cars, not the prototype version, which is, those really cool looking futuristic vehicles. And I said, well, can we win? And he looked at me and said, well, not really, but at least we can enter. And I pointed in my office. I had a model version of the Jaguar Formula One car. And I pointed to that. And I said, what is that over there? And he said, well, that was the Jaguar Formula One car. And before I tell you what I told them, I got to give you a little history. So back in the late 90s, I think it was the late 90s. Yeah, late 90s, we had purchased the Formula One team from Jackie Stewart. And we named it the Jaguar Formula One team. And so by the time I got to go and run Europe and the luxury brands, this was in like 2002, I was always talking with the Jag team on, tell me about our competitiveness of our Formula One team. They said, well, and this was at a time where for the Formula One teams, you didn't have a cap on what you could spend. So, you know, Ferrari and BMW, Williams and Mercedes, they were spending like upwards of $280, $300 million. Our budget was like $90 million. And every week we end up on the back of the grid. And I kept challenging them. I'm like, why are we still in this? Well, it's good for the brand. And I'm like, how does being at the back of the grid every race help our brand? And the straw that broke the camel's back for me was we had a race where we had I can't remember which race it was, but we did a promotion with De Beers, the diamond people. And we actually put a diamond in the nose cone of one of the vehicles at the race. So the race goes on, the car crashes. Guess what we can't find? The diamond. So I bet you somebody who was, the cleaning crew that was, clearing the track must have said, ooh, look at this. Put it in, I don't know. But we never found it. And I finally said, that's enough. So we sold the team to Red Bull, and we owned Cosworth Engines, which was the engine maker. We sold that to another entity. And the point being, as I made to the team, if we're just going there to show up, why bother? We should go there to compete and have a chance to win. So when I pointed to the model, I made the point to my head of product development, come back to me with a proposal that's legit. Because if not, it's not going to do anything for us. So he comes back a month later with a great proposal, which ended up being the current generation GT. And then we showed it in the 2015 January North American International Auto Show and got rave reviews. And then we announced that in May that we were going to race in the next year's Le Mans, which was the 50th anniversary of us winning. So in the year leading up to that, I got lots of questions from the media, et cetera. Are you going to win? And, I was very careful. You can't just go out there and say, of course we're going to win. I said, listen, we're going to go out there and we're going to have a car that is really going to compete. And I think it'll give us a chance to win, but we're going out there and we're going to compete. And so we did a couple of series races before that, like the 24 Hours of Daytona, et cetera, and the car was performing really well. So when we got there in the race in 2016, it was fantastic. It was I spent most of the time while I was there, I had my son with me, we spent most of the time in the pits, and we won. We not only won, we had 4 cars in the races, and we came in first. I can't remember. We came in first, and then I think we came in second or third, and a Ferrari had come in either second or third. But we had won, and it was a great testament. And it's interesting when you go to the board and say, here's the program. I told my team, we are not going to go to the board with a program that loses money. So you come back to me with what's the pricing that we have to have on this vehicle, so at least we can break even. And then I'll justify the program to the board by all the earned media that we could get. And so they came back to me and they said, well, Mark, if this is going to be break even, we have to price this thing at like over $500,000. And I said, fine, that's what we're going to do. It was the most expensive Ford we had ever sold. I think the most expensive Ford we had ever sold was the second generation GT, which was, I think, about 128.
How many did you produce?
Of the new one?
Yeah.
So we did a 5-year run, so we produced 1,250. Or maybe it was 1,350.
Not that many.
No.
At what price?
The list price was, with taxes, was about $580,000.
And you sold them?
We sold all of them. We had,
and so you broke even, and so that car that you raced Le Mans was the foundation that you then ran the production.
Yes.
For the GT.
Yep.
To break for the 1,200 cars.
So break even.
1,200?
1,350. So, it was like 225 vehicles a year.
Sold out.
5 years. Sold there. And it was funny. My team came to me and said, we don't know how we're going to do this. So I asked him, I said, go benchmark Ferrari, right? They have great limited editions like Enzos and Super, I said, benchmark them. And they came back, and we only announced when we introduced the car at December or January of 15, we only announced the first 2 years. So we said, hey, we're producing 500 of these. And we said that we would take applications for the vehicle. And we, like I said, we benchmarked Ferrari. And it was fascinating. And the team was nervous. They're like, I know we're going to be able to sell this. I'm like, don't worry. We'll sell every one of them. So for those first 500 cars, we got over 7,000 applications. And there were some people that did like professionally produced videos, but we had a logic to it, right? We gave, we had like a point system. Like if you had owned a previous GT, you would get a certain point. If you had a social media presence, you'd get a certain point, because we wanted the vehicles to be, proudly presented by the owners and things of that nature. But ultimately, the earned media that we got for the vehicle and for the win was probably over $1 billion. And so it turned out to be a very kind of successful program for the company. And I was really proud of the team because, we challenged them, but it all came back to, if you're going to do something, don't do it half-assed, because customers and the market's really smart. And if you're doing just a paint and tape job, we're going to get ridiculed. Versus if you're going to go and compete, resource it appropriately and give yourself a best chance to win. And even if you don't win, you can be respectable.
I think that's a great place for us to leave it. I appreciate you doing this.
Oh, you bet.
So fun.
It's fun.
I could do this for hours with you. I end all these the same. When you hear the word grit, what do you think of?
Perseverance in the face of high odds.
Mark Fields, thank you.
Thank you.